Hi, thank you for joining us for Nutrition and Mental Health. Is There a Relationship? My name is Phoebe and I'm a Professional Development Officer with the PHN. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are all meeting on today and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I just wanted to mention before we start that this session is being recorded. The recording and the PDF slides will become available on the PHN website in the Education Library in the next few days. We are having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to put your questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Presenting tonight, we are very lucky to have Laureate Professor Claire Collins and Professor Tracy Burrows from the University of Newcastle. At the end of this presentation, there will be an evaluation, which will be located underneath the polls tab in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you want a certificate for this session, the evaluation will need to be done. All right, I'll hand over to Claire now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here tonight to present. So once the slides come up, we'll get started. If you've got any question and answers, then just feel free to put them into the Slido Q&A. And Tracy and I, as we said, some will answer direct and some will answer at the end. So what Tracy and I are going to cover tonight is what you can see on the screen. I'll be addressing those first two and Tracy will address the second. So what's known about nutrition and mental health, the importance of diet and dietary behaviours, and understanding the importance of healthy eating for overall mood. In the first half of the talk, these are the 4 points that I'm going to cover. So why should we even bother talking about nutrition in the first place? Well, some of you may know that poor diet actually contributes to 6 of the top risk factors for burden of disease. And if you look on the screen, while tobacco is number 1, poor diet contributes not just to overweight, high blood pressure, alcohol use, it also contributes to high blood glucose and high cholesterol. Collectively, 27% of the national burden of disease is affected by poor diet. And what foods do you think contribute most? Well, I've already shown you the answer. But if you set off the top of your head, what foods do you think are most directly responsible? It's not exactly what you think. So our poor intakes of whole grains is actually the biggest individual contributor. So it's more about the things we miss out on when we have a junk food diet. And that's because you're missing those key nutrients. We do have recommendations or signposts to guide on how to have a healthy diet. And we have the Australian Dietary Guidelines, and you can see that nice long list there of what you should do. And that is operationalised into this healthy eating model called the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. If it's on the plate, eat it. If it's not on the plate, avoid it. That's the bottom line messages. But in fact, this is exactly what we don't do. If we could click our fingers and magically everyone in Australia was eating just like that Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, then we know that the burden of disease would drop by 51% for heart disease. So instead of the former, this number of people experience heart disease. And there's the percentages for other common conditions. The burden of disease would drop by 26% for bowel cancer if our dietary patterns were aligned. Even if we made small improvements in our dietary patterns, the burden of disease as a nation would drop for all of those chronic conditions listed there. So here's a close-up again of the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. That big red circle, they're called the discretionary foods. That means they're energy dense and nutrient poor. And people are often surprised to discover that processed meats are actually in that discretionary item. And that's because of the strong evidence linking intakes to an increased risk of bowel cancer. And what the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating says is to limit these discretionary foods to 10 to 15% of total daily kilojoules. So it's not totally prudish. and to only have them sometimes and in small amounts. Now, the last National Nutrition Survey found that depending on your age group, the percentage wasn't 10 to 15, it's 35 to 40%. So more than a third of the food eaten by Australians is actually discretionary foods. Plain language, they're junk foods. So what are the main culprits? And this is interesting because when you look down now at the individual food groups making up that red 35 to 40%, alcohol meets the national recommendations, it's less than 5%. And you can see there's a small amount from cakes, lollies, pastries, and so on. So in fact, we kind of are adhering, aren't we? Only sometimes and in small percentages. But the problem is the marketing is driving a small intake of all of those foods that collectively add up to a large proportion. And apples are not on that list of foods that are being overconsumed. But ultra-processed foods are. So these are everything that comes in packets and is highly marketed or advertised. You don't see apples advertised, do you? And what do all of those foods have in common? Let me illustrate that rather than try and tell you. So if you start out with a fresh chicken, by law, by food law, it has to be chicken and it can contain some water, but it's got to be less than 5% water. Otherwise, it's actually not fresh chicken and it has to be labeled as such. Once you convert that to the first level of processing, chicken mince, it can be the minced muscle and meat trimmings, but it's got to be 100% meat, no chicken bones in there. And it's actually illegal to put preservatives in chicken mince. That's why you've got to be super careful when you're handling it because it's susceptible to food poisoning. But once you get to chicken nuggets, can you read all that red writing? And if it's too small, it actually doesn't even matter because there's a big long list of other things that are in those chicken nuggets. And not just the skin, the marinade, the flour, the batter. It's all of these other processing agents. And in fact, it can contain some ingredients that don't even need to be declared. So things that glue all of those items together. So it's hardly fresh chicken anymore. And interestingly, Tracy is going to talk in great detail about food addiction, but these are the foods that are more likely to be addictive. They're high in fat, sugar, energy dense, nutrient poor, and adults also report food addictive symptoms for confectionery, baked foods, snacks, takeaways. For children, it tends to be more in association with chocolate, ice cream, treat foods, and party foods. So what's gone wrong that, more than a third of our food supply is actually now ultra-processed or junk foods? And one of the biggest challenges is trying to find out what people eat. Most of us judge what we eat based on what the person sitting next to us is eating or the neighbours down the street. And in general, we think that we really eat healthy. Aspirationally, most people are trying to eat healthy. But part of the problem is that we actually have no idea what we usually eat or drink. Check this scenario. Have you ever gotten to the end of a movie or a football game and you started out with a big packet of potato crisps or a big bag of lollies or a big block of chocolate and you got to the end and went, who ate that? And when you know that the answer was you, but you were distracted, so you didn't even notice. And the other problem is that we have too much choice. Manufacturers want us to believe that we need the 20 to 30,000 items in the supermarket because we need more choice. But there's no evidence that more choice of ultra-processed foods is improving the national dietary patterns. In fact, it's the other way. And then you've got to look at who's telling us what to eat. You can't turn anywhere without being reminded about what sorts of foods, sports stars like. Obviously, why would they have that logo on their shorts if they didn't actually love junk food? So, marketing is designed to sell more so that we eat more. So just one example, I found it hard to get exact data from Australia, but in 2006, the American Institute of Sport was spending $10 billion per year on food and beverage marketing to children and youth, whereas in Australia in general, $12 billion in 2009 spent on advertising. That is a huge amount of money. Imagine the public health campaigns, if only we could snare some of that money. So to turn yourself away and not be affected by food advertising and marketing, you really have to look the other way. And in this article on The Conversation, I've written some tips on how to avoid fad diets and how to avoid all of these cues in the environment that constantly ask you to eat more food. And food cue temptation is a whole branch of psychology on its own. And fascinatingly, psychologists have actually developed a method called exposure therapy, where you expose yourself to the food that you just simply can't put down once you start eating it, and you taste it without eating it in order to desensitize yourself. It sounds really hard, but it's really activating the brain's own self-management areas, and it takes conscious practice and dedication and likely the help of a psychologist. But I did convert the research into ways people who don't have food addiction could use to try and not be lured by all of these food cues. So number one, and I made it into an acronym called RAW. So number one is remind yourself in a really basic way that you're the boss of your own food or your patient or your client, not the food cue. I think if people were more aware that they're being manipulated by food cues, they would feel more empowered to take control. So initially, buying time when you recognize that, oh no, you're in front of your favorite fast food outlet up at the shopping mall, resist temptation by initially just turning your back on the food cue to break the autopilot purchasing, having a pre-organized alternative to the food cue, or whether it's the phone a friend, drink a glass of water, check your phone, something to give yourself a chance to think, are you really hungry, or is this that food cue stuff working to, hijack your wallet and your brain again? That will give you time to think about what the big picture issue is. Is it that you actually want to eat more healthy to feel better, reduce medications, lower your blood pressure, or improve diabetes control? And then every time you're successful in recognizing, hey, this is one of those food cues, adding some sort of incentive to a jar to save up for something that you want to do, whether it's as little as going to the movies or as big as saving up for going on a holiday. So what about then the foods from a nourishment point of view that can nourish your body and your brain? So what is fueling our brains? Is it healthy foods, like these pieces of these sandwiches, or is it actually junk food? And thinking of food as fuel can be helpful. So we looked at what do the observational studies tell us about the relationship between what people eat and how they think and feel. And in observational studies, they're not interventions, so you cannot say this is the cause. You can only look at associations. And what these observational studies tell us is that there is an association between healthy eating and people reporting higher mood and better mental well-being. It doesn't tell you which is the chicken and which is the egg, but it just tells you they go together. And this, in fact, was confirmed in a meta-analysis of 8 cohort studies that found lower depression risk in association with people who ate a Mediterranean dietary pattern. So the big message in that is more vegetables and fruit, fish and healthy foods, and no junk foods. And then there were 9 cross-sectional studies where people had a lower depression risk score in association with a healthy diet, but there were 4 cohorts that found no relationship between depression risk and the Mediterranean diet. And then in another systematic review, there was a relationship between higher fresh vegetable and fruit intakes, and that was shown to strongly correlate with greater happiness, mental health, and higher self-reported well-being. And this was confirmed in 20 cohort studies where they followed people over many years, and 21 cross-sectional where they just asked them once and then left them alone. And that was shown for the Mediterranean diet predominantly. So then we looked at, well, what are the intervention studies telling us? So this is where you take a group of people, you feed them or ask them to nourish themselves with a certain type of diet, and then you look to see how their well-being and mental health improves. And in this, there were limited studies in clinical depression, but there were 16 trials, 15 in non-clinical depression, and the dietary interventions significantly reduced depressive symptoms, but no effect on anxiety. And there was greater benefit for depression and anxiety in females compared to males. In another review, and this is number 2 on that list down the bottom, there were this rapid review, which was led by Tracy, 46 reviews, 67% of the clients or the patients in these studies had either severe mental illness, 20% had depression and anxiety, and 7% had eating disorders and 7% substance abuse disorders. And most found positive effects of the dietary interventions on weight-related or mental health-related outcomes. So the conclusion from that is that dietary interventions are low-cost, safe, and effective for improving nutrition-related well-being and mental health, and importantly, no adverse effects. And in fact, in one study, and this is reference number 3 on the bottom of the slide, it was found that 7 one-hour face-to-face dietary counselling interventions were actually cost-effective in terms of lowering societal costs, even when the cost of food was included. This is really important. This is a massive burgeoning area of research, and there are a number of other exciting studies underway. So working with your clients to try and improve their nutrition-related well-being, bringing in their support network to help, because often people in acute situations are not able to improve the nutrition themselves. Now, why might that be so? Well, many factors cross the blood-brain barrier, some good and some not so good. So water, caffeine, metabolites from the gut microbiome have been shown to have effects on mental health. Ketone bodies, which are breakdown products when your muscles are metabolizing fat, and some other vitamins, minerals, and toxic compounds like lead, mercury, and alcohol. So what you eat affects exam or test or stress situation performance, as well as physical performance, like participating sport. And nutrition can be the missing link. It can be news to people that what they eat might actually affect their well-being. Here's a whole bunch of nutrients needed by the brain. No need to write these down because, as Phoebe said, you'll have this in the slides afterwards. But the brain needs omega-3 fats. They're long-chain fats found predominantly in fatty fish. And you need them to make neurotransmitters, so endocannabinoids. Carbohydrate becomes glucose in the blood, which is the main fuel for the brain cells. Specific amino acids like L-theanine and tryptophan are needed to make neurotransmitters that can also be responsible for the levels of happy hormones in your brain. And there's some of the dietary sources. B group vitamins, I always kind of think of them as like the boxer matches at the bonfire. They're needed to catalyze the biochemical reactions that actually release fuel in the cells themselves. So no B vitamins, and you can develop some specific brain conditions. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Wernicke's it's too late at night, isn't it? And Korsakoff psychosis, which are thiamine deficiencies, which eventually become reversible by the time it progresses to psychosis. And then many of the minerals like iron, zinc, and iodine are actually needed as cofactors in many of those brain chemical reactions. You can also optimize your brain function by drinking a bit more water, or really by not becoming dehydrated. There's been studies done that shown if you dehydrate someone to the level of 2.7%, like when you do the City to Surf, so that a 60 kilo adult at the end of the race would weigh 58.4 kilos, well, then you'll have decreased alertness, concentration, short-term memory, and performance in tracking studies, and likely to have a headache and be very tired. So you want to get the bus home, basically, from something like a fun run. Here's a whole bunch of examples of what we've called brain food snacks. And really, it's just to show you that the food that's good for your brain can be cheap and plain. A sandwich, a can of baked beans, cheese on toast, or a homemade milkshake. And what's interesting is that when you look at surveys of how much people spend money on food, more money is spent on brain unfriendly snacks than on those brain food healthy snacks. This is the last government expenditure survey. It was done in 2016, so it's before lettuce was $10. But the key message in this is that of the roughly $270 a week spent on all food and all drinks, about 120, so just under half, was spent on discretionary foods. And interestingly, the more recent surveys have showed the same thing. So this 2019 survey that was done by Suncorp showed about $285 a week per household on food and about $135 on groceries, and more than half on other things: alcohol, eating out, takeaways, Uber Eats, tea, coffee, supplements and health foods. So when we get alarmed by the cost of food, the biggest area to focus on is actually the discretionary food and not the fresh food at the supermarket. So I talk to people about setting a budget for how much do you want to spend on discretionary food, and then seeing if that's where you can rein in some spending. And have a think about it. $53 for a family supply of fruit and veggies, or $30 for 3 pizzas home delivered. You start to see where the value for money is. The challenge is, of course, that many people don't want to eat this stuff, but this seems really appealing. And then another way to think about these types of foods is, have you got time to eat them? And I don't mean that literally as in time, because of course you've got time. Everyone's got time to eat a donut. It's, have you got time for the energy cost to burn up the energy that's in them? And I've just given 2 examples there. So an iced donut with about 316 calories or 1,300 kilojoules, whichever you're more familiar with, to burn that up, that average person would need 88 minutes of walking or 48 minutes of cycling. And even if you just go, well, I only eat the plain one, I don't eat the ice ones, it's still a 22-minute jog. And you have to start to think, gee, is that really worth it? And then cooking habits. Isn't it a shame that kids don't leave school being able to cook? I think if we recognise that mental health benefit of cooking and sharing food with other people, that it would be a mandatory school subject rather than one term in either year 8 or year 9, where you don't generally learn how to make a food budget or how to prepare healthy food. But what's interesting in some of the surveys is that whether people cook at home a lot or don't cook at home as much, the survey that I found was that they both spent about the same amount of money on groceries, whereas the people who didn't cook at home as much still bought the groceries, but spent a lot more on food away from home. So that tells you that either food's being wasted or that people are consuming more. So again, the message is eating away from home costs a lot of money and can really blow out your food budget. Okay, so what tools have we got in our kit that we can share with you that you can use to help people? And they need to be legitimate, don't they? You need to be able to trust them. So we've created this website, Healthy Eating with No Money, No Time. It's a multi-year partnership with the NIB Foundation, who've provided funding to support us. And the name of the site, No Money, No Time, came from young adults that we spoke to who said, you know what, we do care about nutrition, but we don't have any money and we don't have any time. You'll have to solve that. So, wow, we think we can solve that. So this is the website. This is how to eat nutritionally adequate with brain-friendly food for $60 a week for one person. It includes the menus and the shopping list. Prior to lettuces being $10, it did used to be $55 a week, but we've uploaded it. So if you just updated it, revised all the prices for current supermarkets, and it's $60 a week. And one of the key things to help your clients with is to get them thinking about that household budget. So while 65% of households say, yeah, we have a food budget, 1/4 say, well, actually, we don't stick to it. And about 1/3 say don't have a food budget at all. So the only way to save money and to focus on buying more of those brain foods is by actually planning meals ahead. And that's why in the recipe section of No Money, No Time, there are lots of recipes. And if you click on this filter that you want sharper thinking, then you can actually get a whole list of recipes that include those brain-friendly nutrients. And if you come to this Hacks and Myths page, up here we also have an ebooks page, and we have a whole ebook on food and mood, a free downloadable cookbook that we co-created with Headspace down at Lake Haven and Gosford. No Money, No Time also includes this nutrition screener, the healthy eating quiz. So it gives you a basic assessment of your dietary patterns and how they align with the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating and the dietary guidelines in less than 10 minutes. And it compares your score to an age and sex matched population group. So it starts helping people, and then it pushes recipes. If you sign up, it starts pushing recipes toward you. But sometimes people need more help than that. And so we have another tool that we use in telehealth consultations, including in our free student clinic. The final year students have a telehealth clinic where we break people's dietary patterns after they fill in the survey for them into all of those red food groups and the green healthy groups from the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. So they can help set a goal and work out which of these foods they're eating because of those nasty food cues. And it also shows them how their nutrients, so those nutrients I told you that actually that your brain needs to make the neurotransmitters, it compares red, amber, and green to the nutrient reference values, and then provides a list of foods. Now, for our first study, once we created this online platform, we looked at what happens if we just give people that report versus telehealth consults from a dietitian. And we found that both of them led to improved dietary patterns, but just giving people the report alone, they're able to drop those red foods by 4.5%. But with the telehealth consultations, they were able to boost that by another 7% and had an 11% reduction. So going from like 30% down to 20%, that's like amazing improvement. And if everyone in Australia could do that, imagine how much less tax we might all have to pay, because everybody would be getting the benefits of better health and well-being. Here's the Australian Eating Survey website. If you want to know more about it, and you see the note there, that one is actually not free. A lot of our research colleagues around Australia use it in their research interventions, and some clinicians use it in their private practice. So what are the take-home messages? Well, current eating habits in Australia are not optimal, and they're not brain-friendly. Eating better helps improve brain function, physical performance, mental health, and well-being without the risks associated with other types of interventions. Please use our trustworthy nutrition resources that are on the No Money, No Time website. And it's really important to prioritise strategies to help people, as well as yourself, but to help people and those around them who may be assisting a person with mental health challenges, getting them to assist the young person or the older person to improve their nutrition for those improvements in their well-being. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Tracy Burrows for part 2, and I'll jump over onto the Slido and answer some of the questions while Tracy's presenting, and then we'll answer all the questions together at the end.
Thanks so much, Claire. As we're moving into the second half of the presentation, I think it's really important to acknowledge really the diversity that when we're talking about mental health conditions, I guess the really broad spectrum of the range of conditions where nutrition plays a role. So Claire briefly mentioned and talked about what we know about foods and dietary intake in relation to depression and anxiety. But she also considered severe mental illness, so things such as schizophrenia and psychosis, but also things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and it covers a whole range of different conditions. So as we're moving through and talking about dietary intake, nutrition, and how these influence mental health and well-being, we really need to consider that broad spectrum of mental health conditions broadly. So Claire focused in on thinking about dietary intake, so selecting particular foods, whether it's fruit and vegetables or processed foods or Mediterranean diet. And for this part of the presentation, I'll complement that by making us consider, I guess, a broader lens and thinking about eating behaviours. So eating behaviours are very prevalent in many people, but we can consider them in this mental health population as well. So by eating behaviours, it could be things such as regular meals, it could be consuming breakfast, it could be night eating late at night when perhaps many people may be having trouble sleeping. And in particular, I'm going to focus in on talking about addictive overeating. Let's get the slides to change. So we know that there's a relationship between dietary intake and mental health. So mental ill health for those with an existing condition and the behaviours. But the other important part to acknowledge here is, in the context of tonight's presentation, is really some of those physical ill health or physical comorbidities that we often see at much higher levels or a much higher extent in mental ill health populations. So we know that they often have a higher or 2 times the level of prevalence of overweight and obesity, 2 times the level of diabetes. They smoke 2 to 3 times higher than what we find in the average population. And we have cholesterol levels that are sometimes 5 times higher. And these all culminate into an end statistic that sometimes people might hear, where we have a big discrepancy between the mortality rates of those with a mental ill health condition. So I guess when we're thinking about this, we want to really think about dietary intake and the behaviours affecting mental health, but also mental health affecting our dietary intake, and also alongside that, these physical comorbidities where dietary intake has a really prominent role. So things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, weight management, they all have effective dietary interventions where dietitians can play a really big role, and there's effective treatments in place. Just get that screen to load. So dietitians have been acknowledged as really important in this area, and we've seen some key publications or key reports, particularly from places such as the Lancet Psychiatry Commission, where we saw the physical comorbidities really prioritised, and they identified this really urgent need for optimised lifestyle interventions where dietary intake plays a pivotal role alongside other lifestyle components such as sleep and physical activity. We also saw dietary intake acknowledged in the World Health Organization guidelines, and these were in particular relation to severe mental illness disorders and lifestyle interventions. And we also have clear clinical guidelines from the Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatry that now mandate lifestyle interventions as our first line treatment in their clinical practice guidelines. So before moving into talking about eating behaviours, I do think it's important to acknowledge the biopsychosocial model of mental health and the implications that these can have for considering dietary intake. And I guess some of these can be really important touch points or ways and means to instigate or start a conversation around dietary intake or dietary behaviours. So we can see that there are nutrition issues or considerations that we can have with our clients. There's cognitive barriers, there's social barriers, and it's really important to, I guess, acknowledge that for individuals where we can make a certain choice about a particular food, we really need to put that in the context of the whole process. So we are asking people to make a decision to eat or not eat. We're asking them to then consider how they're going to access that particular food, transportation to actually get that particular food. Then we're going to have to prepare the food, portion the food, consume the food, and then do it all over again multiple times per day. So in the context of mental ill health, where we might have additional considerations for cognitive barriers, these decisions around food choice and dietary intake sometimes aren't at the top of their list. So I guess it's really important just to contextualize that in tonight's presentation. Sorry, I just got a delay on the slide there. So dietary intake is really important, as Claire acknowledged, and now we're going to focus in on a little bit on the behaviours, and in particular addictive eating, or food addiction as it's sometimes termed. Now this is quite topical because often we see this, I guess, in the media. People might talk about it, clients might ask us about it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research of what we know in human studies. So, putting this in the context, I guess, initially around substance use disorders, as when we think about food addiction, this may be some other things that kind of, I guess, immediately spring to mind. So, when we think about substance use disorders, we can think of I guess, components. So things like illicit substances like drugs or perhaps alcohol, but we can also consider behavioral addiction. So things like the internet or gaming. So what we know about all of these particular instances is that not everybody who engages in these particular behaviors, or not everybody who consumes a glass of alcohol on the weekend, actually becomes addicted to these particular components or behaviors. And that's exactly what we see in food addiction. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I guess this really starts to question when we talk about food addiction. Some researchers and clinicians have taken an avenue of research and understanding that there might be particular components in food driving addictive behaviors towards particular foods. So it could be excess fat or sugar or salt, or things that Claire was discussing in processed foods. But we know we consume food for so many different reasons. And so, for that reason, food addiction can also be considered a behavioral addiction, where people might associate a particular location or a particular environment with consumption of particular foods. And this is what we see in the case of food addiction, is that for some individuals, it could be initially driven by something in a food and it's a very rewarding behavior. And then it transitions to perhaps more of a habit. And so we know it's not really a one size fits all approach in this food addiction area. Next slide. So, what we know is from really large cross sectional surveys is that at any one particular time, around 47% or half the population self perceive themselves to have a food addiction, and that 86% of people believe that certain foods, likely those ultra processed foods that Claire was mentioning, do actually have addictive tendencies. So, I guess if we all think about that, we've probably all proclaimed our own at some stage, whether it's addicted to caffeine or coffee, or perhaps it might be chocolate or some other type of food. So, these are probably unsurprising. So, when it comes to food addiction, it's not currently recognised in the DSM criteria where we find other mental health conditions defined, but we do have self assessment or self report tools that do map to these same criteria for substance use disorders that we can use to help us understand this particular area or these behaviours that people are reporting to us as clinicians that they have towards particular foods. So, when we look at systematic reviews where we synthesize lots of those existing single studies into one actual paper or one actually review, what we see is that around 15 to 20% of the population actually have these addictive eating behaviors that it actually impacts on their day-to-day functioning. So the Yale Food Addiction Scale is the most common tool that's used to operationalize food addiction. If we just go to the next slide. And what this tool, it's a self-report tool, and similar to other substance use disorders, we can assess a range of symptoms. We can also classify, depending on those number of symptoms, a classification if it impacts on someone's day-to-day functioning. And then we can give it an overall classification of mild, moderate, or severe, depending on how many symptoms someone actually endorses. So ranging from 3 as a mild food addiction, all the way through to severe, where someone might endorse 7 or more of those 11 symptoms that we would see using this tool. So you can see on the slide what some of those symptoms might actually be. So we have substances or food taken in larger quantities than intended, a persistent desire, repeated unsuccessful attempts to quit. And you can see they also includes things such as strong cravings, tolerance, and withdrawal. The ones that are the most common that we see in published research from consumers with lived experience of food addiction is that it's a great deal of time spent thinking and obtaining particular foods, and also tolerance, where we have people consuming large amounts of foods or a marked increase in certain amount of foods consumed without the desired effect. So what we mean by that is that perhaps someone initially might have had a rewarding experience with a particular food, and they've gone to gain that extra rewarding feeling, and they've engaged in that behavior or that consumption of food, and over time they've felt like they've needed more food to achieve that desired result. But it is very diverse in terms of which symptoms are actually endorsed by a particular individual. And what you can also see on that slide was that some of those symptoms that are assessed using the Yale Food Addiction Scale, they are specific to food addiction, but some of them are a little bit more generalized. So things such as a repeated undesired attempts to give up a particular behavior. So, many people in the population, regardless of their food addiction status, would probably likely engage that, because we know really broad cross-sectional studies, if you asked an average adult, they've probably tried to give up or change their dietary intake in some way, shape or form. So many people would probably endorse that particular symptom. Moving on to the next slide. So addictive eating is defined as this compulsive overeating, and it impacts on someone's day-to-day functioning. What we know from existing research in humans is that most often it's associated with females. It does occur in males. It's associated with higher weight status, so more likely in the overweight or the obese category, but not always. So we do see food addiction also occurring in healthy weight populations. And what we do know is that it often is associated with a range of different mental health conditions. So this would include things such as depression and anxiety. We also see it associated with things such as post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of these mental health conditions, we might see food as a reward, or to elevate low mood in the case of depression, or as a distraction from somewhat anxious feelings, or to simply elevate mood. Or sometimes we also see it in people who may have had an existing other type of substance use disorder. And when that substance has been taken away, we see a substance switch over to food to gain that rewarding feeling. So it's quite diverse, but we do see this overlap. And it's not to say that it always occurs in all of these individuals. It does occur in males, but what we often see is that we see a high level of symptoms occurring in our male populations, but perhaps aren't endorsing that clinical impairment where it's impacting on their day-to-day functioning. So that's an area of increasing interest. So we see food addiction being investigated in published research in a whole host of different population groups, ranging from clinical populations in the acute setting, so in hospitals. We see it investigated in overlap with disordered eating. We've seen it assessed and reported in bariatric patients, where we have a much higher level of increased weight status. We've seen it investigated in children and adolescents. So there is quite a lot known in this particular area, and it continues to grow. So what we do see and what we do know from most of the work initially was undertaken in adult populations, and what we've seen in research is over time going back in time. So we've now got a whole host of research emerging in the adolescent space. And what we know is that in the adult space, we most often would see food addiction in its severe form. So most people would be endorsing probably 6 or more symptoms of those ones that I showed you. And impacting on day-to-day functioning. And when we see reports of food addiction in adolescents, we most often see it in its mild form. So people endorsing probably 3 or 4 symptoms rather than 7 or more that we see in adults. So whilst there's not been very many longitudinal studies of tracking over time because of the recency in the abundance of this research in food addiction, but collectively adolescents, we see a progression over time in the severity and the number of symptoms as we move from adolescence into young adulthood and then into older adults. What we also see is that a large proportion of the work that I'm interested in is learning from consumers with their lived experience. And what we do know is that many, while we can't collectively say as a whole, everybody's experience is similar, we do see some reports where people tell us that they've known they've had these addictive relationships with food from an early age. So perhaps some of the quotes that you can see on the slide here is that many reported that it started in childhood, or they can remember the first time, or perhaps they've started doing it in secret, or they've perhaps started doing it in a particular location such as their bedroom, or it might often happen at night. So I guess these are some of the interesting things that we've started to uncover unravel as we've investigated this further. So, as I said, in this mental health space and understanding, consumers play a huge role in understanding, gaining this greater understanding in the area of food addiction. So, what we do know is that there's usually, when we've interviewed and done qualitative research, is that we see high levels of control around particular food or around their weight. And we also see another theme that emerges from our interviews around compulsion, which is really, I guess, characterized by the cravings or the urges or the impulses that I guess come to mind when someone thinks of behaviors that might be associated with food addiction. We also see people reporting that they're consuming foods for these other reasons other than being hungry. So it is around these psychological reasons for consumption of particular foods. We also see that, again, this emergence of whether it's something in the food, so the substance, so addictive foods per se, or perhaps addictive eating behaviors. So perhaps in some individuals, it may not be linked with a particular food, but it could be like a craving for a feeling of fullness, or a behavior just in eating in general. Sometimes we see interesting foods come up, things like breakfast cereal, which have got a really crunchy texture, and people will relate to that because they're really feeling really stressed and getting that satisfaction or those levels of reward from those particular foods. So we were also interested in looking at this research area of clinical practice in quite a diverse lens. So we have, excuse me, talked to consumers, but we were also really interested in what health professionals thought of this, given it's not currently in the DSM criteria. But we really undertook a study where we interviewed and surveyed a whole range of health professionals, ranging from GPs, psychologists, dietitians, people working in an acute setting, private practice dietitians, to see if we could get an understanding if this was just something that was being reported by consumers, as in this addictive relationship with food, or are people actually trying to seek help for these behaviours when it comes to food. So what our research showed was, when we were interested in asking health professionals, that a large proportion of health professionals had told us that they had been asked by their patients about addictive eating. So 72% had been asked about addictive eating, 50% believed that food addiction can be a stigmatizing term. So this is something that's another area of interest and understanding, is that particular terminology. And I guess this evening I've sort of been talking about food addiction, but I've also been talking about addictive behaviors. And there's not really a one size fits all term that fits this particular area. And I would encourage you to consider that if you're talking with patients or starting to understand if perhaps addictive eating is something that fits with this particular patient or fits with this particular consumer or client. So you can see down the bottom that food addiction wasn't really a great term for health professionals, but perhaps compulsive overeating or compulsive overeating disorder might be some other words that you can use. So people will also sometimes refer to it as an overlap with binge eating, but could really characterize a difference. So as a health professional myself, I'm really interested in this area of food addiction and in the context of mental health, because I guess I really want to know is, if food addiction is a thing and people are asking for help on it, are we able to provide some better advice, or what kind of treatments are out there, or how could treatments look a little bit different than the standard traditional dietary approaches that we might use, say, for example, for weight management. So we did a couple of systematic reviews to synthesize this area. So I think what we initially did is, if someone was to search for help for food addiction, there is a huge abundance of self-help groups that are available. And these self-help groups are readily available on the internet, and there are tens upon thousands of members to some of these large organizations such as Overeaters Anonymous, Food Addicts Anonymous. So we did a review of those particular online help groups, and we found that very often health professionals weren't utilised or they weren't evaluated. But we do recognise that these can start the process of treatment for some individuals because they do provide that sense of peer support and a sense of connection when people may be sitting at home feeling quite isolated, not wanting to go into a health practice setting, and wanting to be at home feeling quite stigmatized within themselves, but also perhaps what might occur at another health setting. So we do have this abundance of self-help groups, and we did do a review on that. And more recently, what we've then seen is that health professionals are starting to look at what types of interventions may be useful for this subset of vulnerable individuals who are experiencing addictive like eating behaviors when it comes to particular foods. So these treatments that are currently exist in research really are on a spectrum, ranging from quite passive interventions from those self-help groups, merging all the way through to psychosocial interventions, a few lifestyle interventions, through to a few other invasive type treatments such as bariatric surgery. So I was going to tell you a little bit about an intervention that we've been working on just to see what we could better understand and how could health professionals kind of come together. So initially we started a program known as the TRACE program. So this is targeted research on addictive and compulsive eating. And we initially did a feasibility study to, I guess, let us understand if people were going to be open to for getting some kind of treatment or management for food addiction. We did a process evaluation on that to find out what people liked, what they didn't like. And then we found that we could recruit people to the intervention. We did this in adults initially, and it was a 3-session program that was a brief intervention that originally was started in the addiction field and based on personalized feedback and personality profiles. So what we did is we took this process evaluation of what people liked and what they didn't like, and then we've gone into a much thorough research process and using the process of co-design. So we talked to a whole range of consumers with lived experience of food addiction, but also had comorbidities of other mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety. But we also brought a whole range of health professionals from a range of different backgrounds into one place so that we could all start to get on the same page. Because what we often found in these food addiction, talking to consumers, that perhaps they've tried to talk to a GP about it, or they may have tried to talk to a dietitian, or they might have been getting help from a psychologist, or so the topic of food addiction could come up in multiple areas. So we asked psychologists, neuroscientists, addiction specialists, substance use disorders, dietitians to come together to see what we could put together in terms of a treatment program, taking into consideration what we'd already learned from our initial feasibility study. And we've just finished a randomized control trial of 150 people with addictive eating. And we've compared a telehealth intervention, and we decided specifically to make it telehealth to really allow people to participate from home so that they didn't have to travel, increasing that access of reach and services to perhaps areas where dietitians may not be available. And then we compared that to a self-guided workbook and a website where it houses a lot of the materials, and then we have a waitlist control. So we've only just finished recruiting into that, so the results are still pending. And the other area of research that we're really interested in is combining that, but utilizing a few more robust objective measures. So we currently recruiting 2 participants into our TRACE program. So 5 sessions of telehealth that is based on personalized feedback from lifestyle factors. So things such as dietary intake, their eating behaviors, sleep, physical activity, caffeinated sweetened drink intakes. But in this particular component of this study, we're really interested in some of those objective measures. So we're collecting a whole range of hormones, as well as getting some MRI brain scans to see if this behavioural intervention is actually going to influence any of these other objective markers. So we're really interested in looking at if there's differences in the brain responses and the hormones, and can they be changed through behavioural interventions. So in summary, addictive eating is a really evolving area. Even in this time that I've been working in food addiction, we've seen a really big growth in this area and increasing our understanding, but there's still lots of components that remain to be understood or explored in a little bit more detail. I'd really encourage everyone who's listening to really have an awareness of perhaps food behaviours that may be in relation to someone's mental health or in fact their mental ill health condition. And again, summarizing it together with what Claire had presented about food and dietary intake. So there's lots to discuss, but there's lots of opportunities where food and mental health can arise. So be really open and responsive to questions arising around addictive eating, and know that there are some pathways forward, and perhaps think about the different approaches that could be utilized rather than a standard, weight loss or diet. So what we really know is that one size fits all isn't really going to be effective in these addictive eating behaviours. So I'm just going to talk through now, and Claire will jump on as well. We're just going to talk through a couple of different case studies to really unite what Claire and I have been talking about tonight. So the first case study here is that Janine is a 58-year-old female. She's got 2 teenage daughters, and she gets quite anxious and often gets cravings. She feels that she often eats more than she's planned. So her statistics or health profile is that she has a BMI of 30. Her medical records show a family history of heart disease. She has trouble sleeping at night, and she often snacks in her bedroom. So we've got a couple of questions there. Is really, what are some of the practical suggestions that we could give for this individual, and what other steps might you take in the management of Janine's mental health? So just have a think about that. Seems probably a typical presentation. Just move on to the next slide. So some of the practical suggestions that we could include for this particular individual when we're thinking about nutrition and mental health is that we could offer suggestions around eating in a particular location. So suggesting eating at her meals at a table to avoid the bedroom, as this could be, I guess, a trigger, and really increasing her awareness of what anxiety and emotional regulation could feel like. And you can see on the slide there that this is one of the things that we include in the TRACE program, is that we ask people to consider, I guess, their triggers for eating. And this really highlights that people aren't really eating for the sake of because they're hungry. There's many, many factors that are influencing why people eat. And I guess really that awareness raising can be one of the first steps in helping understand why we eat the way we do, or why in fact we're eating. So it might be a little bit hard on the screen, but we divided it specifically for the purpose of our program into things that are emotional or a particular state. We've also included times of day. People might feel like they overconsume at a particular time of day in the afternoon, or it could be late at night. It could be in response to particular emotions. And you can also see, as Claire was suggesting, there are particular food triggers. So whether they might be at the supermarket, or they might be driving on their way home. So really that awareness raising. So often when we think, or someone might raise a conversation around dietary intake or having issues around food or a different relationship with food, we might automatically ask someone to perhaps do a food diary. But perhaps something a little bit broader in that might be useful here is thinking about what are all these other triggers of when someone's over consuming particular foods. So the second case study here is that we've got Gary, who's a 43-year-old male and has a BMI of 36, and at a recent GP visit he asked for some help with what he was calling addiction-like behaviours. He wasn't satisfied with his current weight, and his previous medical history says he's got a high number of depression-like symptoms and he works in a stressful job. So some of the simple suggestions that we might have for Gary, we can have a think about those, and what other steps could we do to help Gary with his mental health. So this is a really important time, I guess, in the presentation, is to just reorientate. And I've copied a snapshot from the website about the current eating disorder plans when people might be eligible. And so I'd encourage everybody to go and refamiliarize themselves with who is eligible for an eating disorder plan. Because what we know about food addiction is that there is or tends to be a high overlap with binge eating disorder. And I guess when you read the criteria of what someone would be eligible for on an eating disorder plan, where they can have up to 20 visits with a dietitian and a range of other different health professionals, is that when you, some of those dot points, the first criteria says that they must have anorexia nervosa or meet several of the criteria listed below. And I would encourage everybody to reconsider having a look at what makes someone eligible for those particular plans, because Gary, in this particular instance, with some of his depression-like symptoms and some of his other mental health status, it may actually make him eligible and may benefit from one of these healthcare plans. So as part of that eating disorder plan that GPs can undertake or GPs can refer to another mental health professional to undertake is to score 3 or more on the EDEQ or the eating disorder examination questionnaire. So I'd encourage everybody, I've put a snapshot of that and it's readily downloadable from the eating disorder or the Australian and New Zealand Academy of Eating Disorders. But to score 3 or more, someone can quite easily have binge eating or overconsume particular foods, or just report a loss of control around consumption of particular foods. So I'd really encourage people to go and have a look at that and refamiliarize themselves with the tool, or perhaps we can include the snapshot of the tool in the slides that Phoebe will send after the presentation. So some of the other tools that may be useful here is that we've created as part of our TRACE program that I thought I'd mention, is that we have a range of distractions. So sometimes we'd really encourage people, and I think Claire mentioned, like if someone's reporting particular cravings towards particular foods, it might be about moving through that and accepting that particular emotion and offering some other coping strategies to replace that feeling that they want to go straight away towards particular foods. So we've put these in consider the types of distractions that you would recommend to a client. So you might have known a patient for quite a while and know that they're into either calming distractions or they might be more energizing. And this is some of the things where we've recognized this in our personality-based approaches, is that some of the strategies that we may give to someone who might be more depression prone as compared to someone who might be more from a personality that's sensation seeking, we can recommend some of the distractions that might be more beneficial for those individuals. We also, something else that might be useful in this particular scenario is thinking about a food line. So going back to basics and thinking about what does hungry feel like, and perhaps when is a good time to stop, because sometimes we may eat very fast and we may bypass that line very quickly, and then we'll end up with that feeling of overfullness. And so I guess conceptualizing this and asking a patient to visualize what we're calling a food line has really worked well for us in some of our interventions. And I think we've got one more case study before we can go to broader Q&A. So this one is Alex, and he's a 17-year-old, and he has a BMI of 25. He experiences depression and he lives at home with his parents. He's got a poor lifestyle with low physical activity and small amount of sleep, and his mum often attends his appointments. So this is an interesting one because I guess, tonight's presentation, we're focused on mental health as an individual. But what we know is that from statistics is that, mental health is very common. So I think the statistics are that as 50% of individuals will experience some type of mental health issue in their lifetime. And not only does it affect the individual, it can affect the carers, and it can also affect their families. So we do need to kind of consider that family kind of approach or in this particular issue or scenario. So really, in this particular case study, we can create and ensure there is a really good, strong family focus if that's appropriate. And we can encourage in some regular routine behaviours like sitting and with people and sitting with them. And because we know that sense of connection is really important across a range of different mental health conditions. So if we can tie that connection in with eating with other people at a particular place, such as the table, this is really useful. Or cooking meals can often be a good way for young adults, so in this particular case 17-year-olds, as a good way to create self-efficacy. Now, Claire talked about in her presentation the No Money, No Time website, and I'd encourage people to go there to familiarise themselves for either themselves or perhaps how it could be beneficial to perhaps their consumers, their clients, or their patients. And recently we developed a free downloadable ebook that we developed in conjunction with one of the headspaces on the Central Coast. And there's a free downloadable recipe book on there. And through talking and engaging with consumers, we were able to really bring this to life. So this cooking and self-efficacy was something that really helped many individuals. So I'd encourage you to go to that look as well. So I think that concludes our formal part of the presentation. And I'd really like to now open it up to a broader question and answer. So if people would like to go onto Slido to ask about anything in particular that we've talked about tonight. So welcome back, Claire.
Yeah, and I've got the first question for you, Tracy. There's a question, in these programs you're talking about, is exercise included? Because, we all know about the benefits of physical activity in mood and mental health.
That's a great question. So within the TRACE program, we consider a whole range of different lifestyle factors and importantly include physical activity. So physical activity can be actually a great strategy as one of those distractors. So if perhaps someone feels a particular craving towards particular foods, or they feel they're in a danger zone of time, or they're looking to work through something, walking around the block, doing something small, getting them out of the location. So physical activity not only benefits mood and mental health, but it also can be a great distractor when you're starting to try and change some of these habits that might have been, occurring for a long period of time.
Yeah. And does the TRACE program include physical activity?
Yes, the TRACE program includes physical activity. It also includes sleep, because we often know that all of these things, diet, activity, sleep, whilst we could tease them out as a single factor, they often all cluster together to quite all going together. So perhaps someone not sleeping well often means that they're not feeling great the next day, probably not going to make great decisions in terms of their food choices, which means they're not going to have, great motivation to go and do some physical activity. So in the TRACE program, we consider each of them in separate entities, but then we also try and combine them together to get someone to increase their awareness about how they could all kind of fit together.
Yeah, and Tracy, I think, one other relevant comment there is that even though, it can be stressful for the families, particularly in that case study 3, but focusing on nutrition and where possible, getting that young person to sit at the table or having a rule, even around that main meal, it provides a distraction in conversation as well. I know that's not always possible, especially in acute situations, but that can be a very practical way to support someone. Or if people, live by themselves and they're not able to cook their own meals, then even utilising some of the home delivery weekly meal services where it doesn't have to be cooked. Some of them you have to cook still, but you can utilise those as like a break and to give yourself a break. But at least nutritious meals will turn up at the door. Tracy, I'm just going to go to Slido and read this other question, just because I want you to address it exactly how it was asked. So this person would like to ask about the connection between childhood trauma and childhood abuse with being overweight in adulthood. Do you know if that's been acknowledged or recognised in Australia? And they've put a link through to that from an external reference, but is that something that's come up in your research?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I guess I can speak to that in terms of some of the qualitative interviews through talking with people with lived experience, and I guess not necessarily only about addictive eating, but perhaps the relationship with food. And I guess really what we know from that is perhaps people are consuming those foods, as I mentioned in the presentation, for sort of psychological reasons. And so whether it would be some kind of abuse or something that occurred in their childhood. So the experiences that often individuals talk about, Claire, would be they're highly varied. So they could be ranging anywhere from, something really traumatic that might have occurred, so violence or sexual or something along those lines. But it can also be things such as parents putting lots of pressure around diet on individuals or children when they're little. So around parenting practices around those particular things. So the experiences is quite diverse, but I would say that it has come up and it is acknowledged in quite a few publications.
Okay.
And I feel,
One of the
Claire, I was just going to say, I feel like one of the things when it comes to, I guess, addictive eating is that I guess people get some sense of reward from consuming particular foods. So it might start off with just one particular food, but because they've got that sense of relief, or it's provided that distraction, or it's elevated their mood, or it's filled some kind of gap for them. And because it's filled that, and that your body's got that sense of reward, we do know that that will drive the behavior again. Because I guess all of us can think about, a rewarding experience, and we can probably think of a rewarding experience in our own selves around particular foods. But when we take a vulnerable individual and amplify that, we can see how this starts to become quite an entrenched behavior over time, and maybe why we see, mild conditions in adolescence then forming more stronger trajectories into that younger adulthood. So you can kind of, I guess, see how it might
see the
evolve
progression.
over time.
Yeah. And there's another question for you, Tracy. And, congratulations to your team, because I know that you're now a world leading expert in the interventions for addictive eating behaviors. And the fact that, you've mentioned tens of thousands of people on some of those websites. So I'm sure that's helpful for people to know that someone's interested in developing treatments. So this next question is asking, what are your thoughts on the contribution of sugar or added sugar to addictive eating?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So I think, Claire, in your presentation, you touched on it as well, because I'm sure even without the slide, if we ask people what are the most addictive foods, it's unsurprisingly that it's those kind of flavor combinations. But when we look at the scientific evidence for that, it's not as robust as people might think. So we see it's ultra processed foods, and most commonly things like uh, confectionery, chocolate, can be savory, can be takeaways, it can be all of those types of things. So we haven't actually pinpointed whether it's actually the additional sugar. I feel like sugar often gets the blame in lots of media articles, because I guess it's kind of like the thing that comes straight to mind. But when we look at the scientific research, it tends to be these types of foods rather than an individual component of food. And so I guess I'm really interested in making all of our research really useful in terms of thinking about the foods to make that meaningful information to then pass on to an individual. So we don't sit down to a bowl of sugar. We sit down to eating foods that are combinations of, fat, sugar, salt, a whole range of things, especially, when you've presented that slide, Claire, on chicken nuggets. It really brings to light some of the things that really do go into particular foods.
Yeah, that's right. I think when food is highly processed, but it still keeps the original word in there, like chicken, even though there's not really any chicken left in chicken nuggets. But I think also that it's the sugar is just the whipping person. It's just it's just what people hook onto, but they don't realize about all of these other additional chemicals and level of processing. And the other thing too is that most people don't realize that many of these ultra processed, the most processed foods, the ones that have got that teeny weeny writing and a whole bunch of numbers, and about 12 different words in brackets on the food label, is they are now so palatable that you cannot find a food that occurs naturally in nature with the same palatability. It's exceeded those. So these foods know how to override normal neuroendocrine responses. And, make no mistake, the food industry knows about this. They want us to think that these foods are not addictive. So I'm sure they love it when they go, oh, everyone's focused on sugar. Whereas really it's the combination of fat, sugar, salt, and the other additions that go with it. And, but I think, Tracy, wouldn't you say one of the things we're really trying to do through the No Money, No Time website is really help people think about and develop those skills and get away from ultra-processed foods, but get back into the kitchen, even if all you've got is a microwave. So, that's the way we've set it up so that you can filter for very basic kitchens as well. Now, is there anything you want to say, Tracy?
Claire,
I'm just going to go back to Slido.
I think the other interesting part to think about, Claire, with the No Money, No Time website and how it could be used for individuals with a mental health condition is really thinking about all of the different factors that contribute to someone choosing a particular food, but also when they choose that food, how are they going to prepare it? So one of the things on the No Money, No Time website that people might be really interested in is that you can filter basically on what type of appliances you do or you don't have. So, for example, we might take it for granted that we've all got a kitchen, but perhaps if we lived in a share house, or perhaps if we only have a limited budget, we might only own one fry pan, or we might only own a sandwich press. So all of these additional layers that can create, I guess, another level of difficulty, you can use the website to filter in on that, and it's got a range of recipes that can all be based on perhaps a one pot, or perhaps based on just a sandwich press, for example. And it's really easy to function. So the website, so perhaps if people can access it on their phone, if they don't have an internet connection, at home on a desktop or something like that, it can access from anywhere. And we know that technology, Claire, whether it's telehealth or mobile phones, is that it cuts across many different layers. So, for example, individuals even on a really low income often have a mobile phone, so they can still access this type of information. And as you said, Claire, looking and thinking about nutrition beyond just being something that you eat, to realizing what role it can play for an individual, whether it's a rewarding experience or whether it could be helping them through a really tough time and giving them that self-confidence back, in that case study 3.
Yeah, Tracy, I'll just keep flicking across to
Yeah, that's
Slido to
okay.
see if
Yep.
there's any questions. But one of the things, I know there's all kinds of health professionals online tonight. And we know from some of the other surveys we've done of health professionals that everybody loves talking about food during treatment, especially if you're lucky enough to actually be treating someone hands-on. As dietitians, we're always just talking to people about food or providing the dietary counselling. But I think one of the most important things you could steer the conversation to, when you saw Tracy's presented that addictive-like behaviours have their origins in childhood, is steer the conversation towards family meals and family dinners, because it is something that's lost. Of all the different types of interviews I do, I think that's the most emotive one. And the first time I had a journalist almost in tears, I was really surprised, because family dinners is something that has been lost. And to hear adults say, yeah, I really value family meals, but oops, I don't do that with my own kids, but I expect them and I want my grandchildren to value family meals. So it's something that is easy to be lost in the modern household, that's got 7 televisions and, everybody gets their meal and takes it to their room. Encourage all of your clients and your patients, ask about sitting at the table. And if there's one single family intervention, it's having dinner together at the table. And all this weird kind of beneficial stuff, I shouldn't say weird because it's normal beneficial stuff, happens around a dinner table. People talk about their day. So you're actually providing a mental health prevention intervention for young adults. And when people eat around a table, the vegetable intakes are always higher. And that's because if you're sitting on the lounge, you're not serving peas. And it tends to be fast food. So I think, and even if it's not realistic for your patients or clients to have dinner around the table every single night, ask them how many nights a week they do and what would it take, or what would it look like, or what would have to happen to do that one more night a week than what they currently do. But, for a whole host of other beneficial reasons, not just nutrition, it's the most valuable family intervention for nutrition and mental health that families can participate in.
And Claire, I guess recognizing all the different ways and shapes that meal could occur too. So if you don't live with a family, like it can occur, you can just call someone on the phone and talk to them whilst you're both eating, or you could use technology like a Zoom that people have got really familiar with because of COVID lockdown. You can phone a friend, you could FaceTime. It doesn't have to be family. It could be just another peer, just to have a conversation with someone, because we do know that sense of connection across a range of different mental health condition plays a really important role. And I guess when we think about that overeating, that's why what a lot of people like about some of those self-help groups is that there's a sense of connection or someone to talk to, because many times people feeling at home, feeling quite isolated, they might live on their own or they don't want to talk to someone about it. So never underestimate that conversation that can go along with any meal, Claire. So it could be the lunchtime, it could be breakfast, it could be anything. So whatever shape or form it takes, it's almost in that mental health space, it could be anywhere in between.
Yeah. So Tracy, the next question, but I think you've started answering it, is, what are the suggestions for when someone has no appetite or listlessness? So if they're not eating because they live alone or they have no connection, if that's your, if that's your patient or client's grandparent, or that's them and they are a grandparent age, are there family members who can Zoom them in to a meal? So I know with the lockdowns and in nursing homes and things, that's been a challenge. But I heard someone during the week saying for their grandparent, they now join their dinner every single night via iPad. So they, between the family, they're able to set them up on an iPad, and that's been a practical way they've been able to improve like the nutrition of their grandparent by bringing them in. If somebody does have no appetite or listlessness, then it is always important to go and have a chat to your GP, see if there's any underlying medical condition, if that is related to something like a cancer treatment, for example, or sarcopenia, which is baseline inflammation that's leading to a reduction in muscle mass and a negative appetite. That type of person may need a supplement. You might have heard of things like Ensure or Ensure Plus. So sometimes that would be particularly someone who might be on, say, an aged care plan and already got a number of supports in place. So that's what I would be talking to about the GP, or for that type of patient or client, just checking if they're already on an aged care plan and whether there's any other practical supports, Meals on Wheels, for example. Okay, I'm just going back to check. Okay, well, that was the last question there, but we've still got 10 minutes. So you can ask us anything at all if you've got any burning questions in regard to nutrition. But I think I hope we've made a case for why nutrition is part of mental health, and whether it's someone in your family or a friend trying to provide practical support to help that person eating well, or if it's your client, practical strategies for them to eating well is really going to help improve their nutrition and help prevent other chronic diseases. Now,
and Claire, I think the other important thing, I guess, combining what both of us have discussed tonight, is the importance is considering what people are eating and then considering why people are eating. So thinking about all the different food choices that they can make, and then thinking about why do people eat, and that might open up a conversation around a whole host of different reasons where food and mood might be something to investigate.
Great way to finish off, Tracy. And Phoebe's just sent me a message. She's got a little bit of homework for everyone, so we'll hand over to Phoebe to close off and talk about the evaluation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us and taking the time out of your night and spending it with us. This has been an absolute fantastic presentation. A huge thank you to Claire and Tracy, absolute stars. Can you guys please complete the evaluation? We need the details for your certificates, okay? Enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you so much.